Good afternoon. We will begin our final segment of this terrific and highly informative day, and I am honored to have Yasmin Green with us, who is the Director of Research and Development for Jigsaw, which is an incubator within Alphabet, formerly known as Google Ideas, and it focuses on using technology tools to make the world safer, both online and offline. And Yasmin has experience leading projects in some of the world's toughest environments, including Iran, Syria, the UAE, and Nigeria. In 2012, Yasmin led a multi-partner coalition to launch Against Violent Extremism, the world's first online network of former violent extremists and survivors of terrorism. Based on Yasmin's own interviews with ISIS defectors and jailed recruits, in 2017, Yasmin launched the Redirect Method, a new deployment of targeting advertising and video to confront online radicalization. Yasmin Green is also a senior advisor on innovation to Oxford Analytica, a member of the Aspen Cyber Strategy Group, and until 2015, she co-chaired the European Commission's Working Group on Online Radicalization. Yasmin was named one of Fortune's 40 Under 40 most influential young leaders in 2017, and in 2016, she was named one of Fast Company's most creative people in business. And with the type of job of focusing on making the internet safer, we are glad that you are using your creativity in what is indeed a difficult feat. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
When we talk about the internet, we sometimes consider this two-edged sword. In many ways, the internet is a great way to bring more democracy to the world by increasing expression, sharing of ideas and information. Yet at the same time, that same reach can sow disinformation and create significant problems in terms of managing and directing what type of information people are getting. What do you see, Yasmin, as some of the greatest threats in that area?
I have to pick just my biggest threat online threats. So I started working at Google almost 13 years ago, and I think back to that time and how naive and hopeful we were, and we were really building these like search engines and video sharing sites and social networks, and we were just imagining that the internet's going to make us really just closer and safer and smarter. And at the same time, there were these groups of like repressive governments and terrorist groups and other actors who were really excited about using the internet to make themselves more effective, to surveil better and censor more effectively. And we didn't design the internet with those people in mind. So we now have this open internet that's really vulnerable to abuse. And so what I get to do, the privilege of my role at Jigsaw, is to think about the questions, A, what are the biggest digital threats that we face, and B, how can we develop technology to help address them. And there's a category of cyber threat, which was largely what was discussed in the previous panel, which I found fascinating, which was about kind of the more traditional cyber threat, like hacking of computers and systems with malware. That's what we traditionally think of as cyber attacks. And the type of threat that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about over the last year or two has been a different type of hacking. When we think about the internet as this new and confounding theater of war, the type of threat that worries me a lot is the hacking of the conversation. Because when it comes to this type of threat, we are not even knowingly involved. Even if we're not perpetrators or victims, we very likely are unwitting accomplices. So I'm talking about covert, fake social media accounts, front organizations online who are on a daily basis trying to shape public sentiment and real world outcomes, voting behavior, protests. And there are people that we trust online that we don't realize who they are or what their motives are. And one of the most remarkable things is that this abuse of the internet is unremarkable. Like in our study of ISIS or the Internet Research Agency, we found that there's no particular tech-savvy or technological genius involved in the way that they use online tools. They use them in pretty much the standard way that they're supposed to be used. The thing that made all the difference was that they really had an insight into the human beings that they were trying to reach, and they exploited the internet to manipulate humans. In one case, to radicalize them to terrorist acts. In another case, to meddle in a democracy and an election. So that's the stuff that I think about a lot, because when it comes to traditional cyber, we have a lot of panels, we have national strategies, we have international alliances, we have academic programs to try to study and protect against that threat. But the threat of kind of internet turbocharged psychological warfare is not one that we understand, and it's only one that we're now waking up to as an industry, as one that we need to tackle.
And that is indeed a lot harder to tackle if you have an unauthorized access to a protected computer and a hack of traditional sense. It's a Section 1030 violation, and we can clearly define it. But something like hacking a conversation, as you describe, or getting into the user's mind and manipulating their thoughts, touches upon some really sensitive issues in terms of allowing free speech, not going into censorship. Who are we to judge whether a conversation is appropriate or not? But at the same time, is there a line where it either becomes hate speech or improper supporting of terrorist activities? And how do you navigate that, and who decides?
Right. Well, also, now there's a playbook for this type of threat. It's out there. I've used the phrase before, if you're not actively playing, you're likely getting played. There are no technical barriers to participating. Our ability to attribute activity is really poor, and both at a kind of governance, policy norms level, we're really behind. And so are even the technology companies. They don't. To your point about what's the limit to free speech, we haven't. Those guidelines haven't caught up with the state of the threat. So we're really just beginning to grapple with the challenge.
Do efforts such as education, letting people know more about concerns, let's break it down, maybe looking at fake news specifically, and where people are either tweaking a story to embed some false information or creating completely false stories. How do we address that in particular?
So it's interesting because you say fake news specifically, but I don't know if we could, two of us in this room would agree on the definition of fake news. There are two aspects of the disinformation challenge that I think about. One is coordinated activity, and a lot of our work at Jigsaw looks at geopolitical threats, so state and non-state actors. And when it comes to spotting coordinated activity, like the work of the Internet Research Agency in the US around the 2016 elections, we're optimistic that there are attributes of that activity that you can identify to tackle it that are independent from the content itself. So a big risk that I see is that we will conflate perspectives with objectionable activity. So for example, there are groups right now who are tracking pro-Kremlin accounts online. That's different from tracking Kremlin-sponsored accounts. In one case, these are accounts that express views that are understood to be in line with the Kremlin's agenda, which is fine, that's not a crime. In the latter case, you're tracking accounts that are really controlled by a foreign entity and misrepresenting themselves in the online conversation. I would say the latter is the threat and not the former. So as much as we can stay away from having a content-based deterrence or detection system, we're much better off. So the kind of attributes that I think we should be looking at when it comes to coordinated activity are things like temporal. So you find that a lot of the accounts that were active in meddling around 2016 were tended to act kind of in unison. There'd be a little delay after something that would happen in the world before they would start weighing in the conversation because they had to wait to get their marching orders, which is not how the rest of us behave. They typically operated on a 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Moscow timeline, which is not consistent with like an Arizona mum of two or whoever they were pretending to be. They take Russian national holidays off, not work on the weekends, etc. I mean, it's funny, and it's something that would be really easy to mask once once we discuss it in a forum like this as a signal. But there are definitely temporal indicators. There are relational ones. So the accounts that were active tended to follow each other in ways that were like more clustered than you would expect among organic accounts. And the last is that because they really do get their instructions from top down, and I have in my office a troll farm manual from Russia that's for domestic propaganda, and it's like everything you would expect it to be. It has like the talking points on all the topics, like NATO, opposition leaders, Nemtsov, the ruble, and it has what, the headline to convey, some links to point to, and some discussion items. If you really are getting your instructions from top down, then there should be some semantic similarity in what you post that is anomalous. So, for example, if I said, let's all post today about cybersecurity being an important topic, we would use similar words in response to my prompt than if there were 100 people somewhere else who had that sentiment and were generally expressing it. So the hope is that we can develop detection for coordinated activity based on what just seems inorganic, what normal people wouldn't do, that is different from the underlying content. The other aspect of it, I would say, other than coordinated, is this notion of polarizing. So a lot of the content that we lament being online, whether it's fake or partisan or not, is that it's incredibly polarizing. And this is the stuff that foreign governments kind of piggyback off of in order to sow discord in countries like the US. And one of the areas, again, where I'm really optimistic for technology is that we can build tools that can understand when conversations are inflammatory or intimidating. And this was one of the questions we asked ourselves at Jigsaw, is what could we achieve if we tried to build AI that was as much focused on emotional intelligence as computer intelligence? So we trained some models, which I can talk about if anyone's interested, but we trained some machine learning models to be able to detect when online comments had this quality of being inflammatory or intimidating. And they do a pretty good job, actually, at detecting that.
Is there work to ensure that it's not unduly biased in terms of determining what is inflammatory, or how you're programming or teaching the machines to learn? Yeah,
that's a really good question. So bias in algorithms is an area that is, the consequences are going to be really grave if we don't get this right. I'll give you some examples of, just really quickly to illustrate where our early models got this wrong, and just like an admission of humility that we're going to have to keep developing them. But so we took millions of comments from the internet, and we asked 10,000 people to annotate them according to whether they thought that the comment was an ad hominem attack, an insult, a threat. It's interesting to think that these things would have different linguistic attributes. If the comment would make them leave an online conversation. We found quite a lot of inter-annotator agreement, which is positive for the ability, bodes well for computer algorithms to do something useful. And then when we ran our first models, we realized that the sentence like Yasmin is a researcher, the model didn't think was inflammatory or intimidating, or that would make somebody want to leave an online conversation. But if I said Yasmin is a Muslim researcher, or Yasmin is a feminist researcher, the model thought that was toxic, would be likely to intimidate somebody or make them leave an online conversation. And and then you realize that most of the comments that we got from the internet that mentioned the word Muslim or feminist or gay or black had a negative, they were in a context that was toxic. So the model started to learn that there was some kind of inherent negative association for those words. So we ended up in that case having to go back to news articles and take sentences that had neutral references to those words and then train the models again to basically for them to understand that those are neutral words. But it's a very serious, it's a really serious question. It's a topic that we take really seriously. And if we want to create an internet where you're encouraging inclusive conversations, then you need to make sure that no one's being left out.
And I would imagine that toxic words in one society or one country are very different than in another part of the world or part of the neighborhood.
Right. I was using the example recently of I wanted to demonstrate the technology we built is called Perspective, this AI that understands speech, and I wanted to say, for example, we built an AI that could tell the difference between these two sentences. And the two sentences I was giving as the example were, break a leg at the conference, Judy, versus I'll break your legs at the conference, Judy. Which, it's like this...
You said the first one, right?
It's the same one. But those are like the same words, you know, so it's really amazing that you could... Anyway, but I was in Ukraine, and they had never heard the expression break a leg. So it didn't work anyway, so they both just sounded like violent comments. But to your point, yes. Local context matters a lot. And to be fair, the models work the best in English at the moment. So we've got a lot of work to do to help everyone.
And given that we're in an age where more than half of the world is now on the internet as of 2018, and I believe 53% and 4 billion people, some of the stats say about 60% of internet users are in countries using censorship. Are there ways that people in those places can still have access to broader information that isn't limited?
Yeah, thanks for raising that. So I think when I started working in tech, you know, the term WWW, World Wide Web, just referred to this one internet that everyone had access to, just universal resource of information. And then actually most people in the world have a fraction of the internet that we have, which is the portion of the internet that the government wants them to see. And I really connected with why this is important with an example from the country where I was born, which is Iran. And in Iran, it's considered to be a sin to be gay, because it's under Sharia law, it's a Muslim country. It's a crime also. But the thing that blows my mind is that among many communities, it's also a myth. So the government's position is that you cannot be gay. If you're a man who loves another man, it must be because you're a woman who's trapped inside a man's body. So it must be that you're transgender. And this is a narrative that they put out there, that they can do that because they have a monopoly on information, including online. And they give free gender reassignment surgery. They pay for people to have this surgery, but they don't allow people to determine for themselves whether they truly are trans. So there are people in Iran who are gay and who don't know that that's a thing. So when you realize that, access to a partial part of the internet is having those type of consequences for people in the majority of the world, you realize that it's incumbent on us in the tech sector to make sure that they have access to those tools. So that's a big focus for my group, Jigsaw. One of the tools that we released in the last year is called Outline, and it's a VPN, a virtual private network, which basically just allows people to circumvent their national firewall so that people in places like Iran and other repressive countries can access information that their government might not want them to see.
So 2 years ago, in July 2016, the United Nations Human Rights Council passed a resolution that said internet freedom is a fundamental human right. Have we seen any changes since then, or are we just now in an arms race between countries that try to repress what type of information people can get, and others trying to make the internet more fully available? And who's winning?
I'm less bullish on this question than I was maybe 12 years ago. I'm reminded of a quote from Google's former CEO, Eric Schmidt, where he said that the internet is like the world's largest experiment in anarchy. I think he said that before he was actually had to leave that role, but some time ago, where it felt less, the internet felt less like a dangerous place. But the point was, I think there was a time when we thought that the internet would be, a wild west of unfettered free speech, and we would see all the marvelous things that could be created in that environment. And since then, it's become clear that, well, it's not going to be. The experiment of anarchy has failed, in my opinion, and there are two reasons why. One is because there are very powerful actors, like repressive governments, who have control of infrastructure, and they don't want information to be free. And the second is because it turns out when there is unfettered free speech, individuals and organizations figure out how to use online harassment as a tool to silence and intimidate one another. The timeline that I think of in terms of this question of who's winning or the arms race is one where we're really early on, and there is no manual for how to do this well, and we're learning by doing. And I think that feels really unsatisfactory when you think about the speed and the scale and the severity of impact that the internet allows. But I just have to feel optimistic that we're going to figure out how to make it the empowering tool we once envisaged it to be, but I recognize that's not what it feels like right now.
And as we are on this journey of trying to figure out how to make it safer and more free and access, there are a lot of pitfalls. You mentioned harassment issues. This summer we saw incredible violence in India, for example, where there were misinformation or disinformation campaigns saying certain people were going to steal and torture their children, and then those mobs were going after them and beating them in the street, and other forms of harassment either against a specific individual or a whole community that can be perpetrated through this free internet of saying what you will. Are there technological solutions or social education solutions that we can employ or are using to address those kinds of threats?
Yeah, definitely education. I don't have any control over educational resources or educational policy, so I would love for there to be more of that. On the tech side, there are, I think there are tools to try to help communities moderate their conversations so that they don't become these inflammatory the triggers for violence, like what we've seen in India, and I think perspective is an example of that. The other is, and this is a topic that Judy and I have discussed at some length now, but the other is looking at how images and video are being misused online, either being presented as out of context. So in the case of, I think with India, and the one of the mob lynchings was people were reacting to a picture which wasn't even from India, I think it was from Sri Lanka, about child kidnappers. And then we also have the really sophisticated types of AI-generated video, which you may or may not have seen. But we tend to respond viscerally when it comes to images, and seeing is believing. So the fact that images and video are increasingly being used as a vessel for disinformation should scare us. And we're doing some work to see if we can, A, develop technology that can identify when something's been manipulated, and B, we're trying to do some kind of user focus groups to see if we can help people understand that they're seeing something that isn't real. And it's interesting because my starting point is often what can we do technologically, but when it comes to labeling disinformation, that we have a really an uphill battle to figure out how we can tell people that what they're seeing is not true or not real and have them understand it. So we just did some research with 800 individuals looking at fake videos. We made like a fake video of a historical person performing a stand-up comedy act that they never performed. And we showed 800 people different interfaces to say that this was fake. And then we asked them afterwards, do you think that what you saw was fake, the video was fake? And only like 60% of them thought that it was real, even though we had told them that it was fake. So I don't know what's going on, but there's something with label, like if you look even at the kind of the academic field in terms of labeling things like fake news, it's really sobering. The jury's still out on how you label this stuff to convince people. So maybe you got to come back next conference and talk to you more about what we've learned there.
And that's the area of deep fakes and synthetic media.
Right.
And I know you've shared with me before a concern that even after something is, again, reinforced as not true, people, the studies show, may still come back and think that it may have happened, which is sort of the pernicious nature of a rumor, for example, that then somewhere in their background they think, was that true or not true? Right. And with the prevalence of the internet, some of the studies are showing that in certain countries, if people are not engaging in debate on political topics, but instead just focusing on the entertainment, it actually helps the authoritarian regime because it suppresses an interest in speech and discussion and debate on political issues and sort of pacifies the population. And again, I come back to the same question of who's to say if what's right or not right about what people have access to, and is it appropriate for a country to decide what flow of information they want on the internet, or are we really going back to the days of the good old WWW, the World Wide Web, not the World Wrestling, whatever. But do you see which direction we're moving on those?
No, and I think this highlights the need for both governments and also technology companies to express what their values are. What does a Google promise to its users in terms of, yes, making your life easier, but in the transparency about what's happening with your data, and a guarantee to keep you safe. And it's interesting in the case of Russia's famous for kind of the distraction by entertainment, and also China does something similar with its online, the 50 centers and the online government agents in China. But in the case of Russia, which is interesting, we saw this in the US, they were engaging on every side of every issue. So they were pro-gun, anti-gun, they were like pro-immigration, anti-immigration. This is like that's the Soviet mindset, is they want to be influential on every side of every major topic so that they can then wield influence when the time comes. We just spotted an extensive campaign by Iran to influence audiences in 4 different continents with social media accounts. So they had accounts in Italian, accounts in Spanish for Latin America, accounts in English for the Brits. And they were actually coming in very much on one side of, they were anti-Trump because they because they want the nuclear deal to be reimposed. They were for Muslim candidates in the various elections. So you actually see that different governments are meddling in different ways. So they do have their own values and approaches, but I think that the other players in this, people, us, and also the tech companies should have their own positions, and they should be really transparent about them.
I do think transparency is a key in terms of addressing the awareness among people so that they are making conscious decisions and choices about what they're looking at. I would love for you to just talk, if you would, for a little bit of some of your fascinating field work that you've done in the area of violent extremism, if you could talk to us about that. Combating violent extremism.
Yes. This was like one of our first focus areas in our group was looking at violent extremism, which back in 2011, people didn't think the internet had anything to do with why anybody would sign up to, go and fight with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan or join Aryan Nation. Now, I feel like the pendulum swung the other way, and people are like, if it wasn't for the internet, there'd be no ISIS. Neither of those positions, I think, are true. But early on, we brought people together from different ideologies, which was very controversial at the time. So we had religious from across. We had former Christian militia, a former violent Israeli settler, former Islamist Al-Shabaab. We had nationalists, Tamil Tigers, IRA, and former white supremacists. And we brought everyone together in one place to talk about their path into violent extremism and their path out, and the role of technology within that. And it was, a lot of people were very dismissive that there would be anything common to the path into radicalization for people who were coming from such different ideologies. But it turns out that there was a lot in terms of their search for purpose and identity and fraternity, and also in their path out in terms of maturing, or it was often the birth of a child or the death of a loved one, and then it was like the early days of the internet and understanding the role there. But one of the programs that we designed as a result of engaging, I personally went to Iraq and interviewed a dozen former members of ISIS who had defected to understand how technology played a role in their radicalization. And what we learned was, technology often played a role in their radicalization, that even the people who described kind of the brutality and devastation and corruption they saw when they went there, and the fact that they risked their lives to leave, when you said to them, if you knew everything you know now about what ISIS is really like, if you knew that the day that you left home, would you still have gone? They invariably said, yes. And then you think, well, that's not very promising then for what I could tell you to change your mind. And then they said, because at that point we were so brainwashed that there's no information that could have changed our mind. Then you say, if you were given alternative answers to those questions you had 6 months before the day that you packed your bags, then could that have changed your mind? And they say, yes. So we were kind of, developed a bit of a appreciation that they have questions that are in some way legitimate questions. The answers they were getting from terrorist groups weren't legitimate, but they had questions about religious legitimacy and what kind of social support system there is, or the role of women, or what the specifics of what's happening on the military battlefield. And there are many different sources of answers for those questions, but in the case of ISIS, they were really shaping the conversation. Their former spokesperson, who's now been assassinated, Al-Adnani, said, if you want to know what ISIS thinks about any topic, just consult our thousands of leadership statements. And they put them online. So they were shaping the conversation, and they were directing people to answers that were radicalizing them. So we designed a program that used targeted advertising to find people who were searching online for terms that showed that they were on the radicalization path. And then we were giving them the opportunity to get answers from, defectors or preachers who were not ISIS extremists, or to see citizen journalism from the caliphate. So we launched this program in Arabic and English to target violent Islamists. And in 8 weeks, we reached 300,000 individuals who we thought were demonstrating some positive sentiment towards militant Islam. And then they were watching hundreds of thousands of minutes of video that could change their mind, hopefully. And since then, the program's been deployed, the redirect method has been deployed to target the violent far right and other ideologies around the world too.
Great. So that's an excellent example of using technology to further educate really the masses and offer alternative viewpoints. So ultimately, people can still choose, but at least they're hearing a more diverse perspective. If you would also talk a moment on, you mentioned being in Ukraine, but some of your field work there with regard to Russian influence peddling in Ukraine and what you've seen.
Well, okay, so our mindset with regard to Ukraine is that they're coming up to two important elections in 2019, presidential and parliamentary elections. So that's an interesting context to study because elections are always like a magnet for state-of-the-art cyber attacks and info ops. But the interesting thing is that the 2018 midterms in the US have been fairly quiet. There's been a little bit of Russian and Iranian activity, and also some domestic groups are now looking at the playbook and using it to spread disinformation. But we haven't seen any tactics that differ significantly from what we saw in 2016. So the risk is that we're going to go into 2020 in the US fighting the tactics of 2016. So our thinking was, if there's nothing that Russia would do to the US in 2020 that it wouldn't try out first on Ukraine in 2019, because Ukraine's on its doorstep and it behaves with impunity in Ukraine. So we basically set up a kind of a year-long research focus on Ukraine to study the laboratory of cyber attacks that are happening in that country. So we just went there and met with a lot of the political campaigns, and also went to the conflict area, Donbass, one of them, to understand what disinformation looks like, both in conflict areas and also in that political context. And the interesting thing was that there really are three fronts to the disinformation war in Ukraine. The conflict, which is heavily coordinated with military activity. The domestic stuff, which is targeting political candidates, and also focused on degrading the relationship between Ukraine and its EU allies. So the big, question about Ukraine's future is it going to look more towards Russia or the EU? And that was the catalyst for the 2014 Euromaidan protests. Russia wants it to look to Russia. Many of the people, though not all of them, want it to look to EU for cultural and economic ties. And one of the ways that the Kremlin has realized that it could decrease the chances that Ukraine looks towards the EU is if it can sour relationships between Ukraine and its EU partners. So Poland, for example, has been a great focus of disinformation. So there have been narratives targeting Polish populations about how Ukrainians are desecrating graves of Polish in Ukraine and bringing up some World War II atrocities. And indeed, the relationship between Ukraine and Poland has really deteriorated over the last couple of years. So the reason that these disinformation campaigns continue is because they work.
I feel we've been, there are hours more questions I could ask you on these issues, but I'd like to give our audience a chance in the few minutes we have left, if there are any questions that you may have for Yasmin.
Hi, thank you for being here. So I have a quick question. I know there's so many areas of analysis that you can actually dive into. How do you decide where you go first and where you can make the most impact? Thank you.
Yeah. That's a really, really good question. So it used to be, we were really focused on ending repressive censorship. We were like, the big threat is that people in the world won't have access to all of the internet. And then we realized that actually, access to information in itself can be a weapon. And so we developed these work streams that are focused on harassment, polarization, radicalization, etc. So those are really our key focus areas. The way that we narrow it a little bit is that we look at geopolitical threats. So just ad hoc douchebaggery on the internet, which we all object to, probably wouldn't be in scope for us. And we also try to do something that, we try to focus on things that core Google isn't already focusing on. So for example, fake news in itself is, there are tens of thousands of engineers at Google who are thinking about ranking things in the right order in search. It doesn't require a team of 100 in New York to focus on that too. So we always try to think about what's around the corner and what's geopolitical and what would otherwise be in the company's blind spots.
Any other questions? We have time for one more.
Yes, I was wondering, do you feel more optimistic about the ability of the international community or the next generation to understand the nature of the internet, its possibilities, but also its vulnerabilities. Do you feel more optimistic about that, or about our ability to solve the technological challenges of shaping it or controlling it? Do you think the human factor or the technological factor is the larger challenge?
Do you have a humanities background by any chance? I'm optimistic that I think that we are increasingly appreciating like the perils of trying to solve things with computer science alone. And, and often when people, they like paint a dystopian future which is based on like super smart AI, and I'm worried about super dumb AI. Like, I'm not, dumb, like, not, it's artificial dumbness, not artificial intelligence I'm worried about. Like, we're just putting algorithms everywhere, and we don't fully understand how they work. And they, they're built very, very homogenous group. We're shifting away from that. So that's the thing that makes me feel optimistic. Like, on my team, we have, like, ethnographers and anthropologists and people who are helping us really just try to engage with the messiness of radicalization and why, conspiracy movements, and those are not fundamentally computer science problems. We need to have computer science responses, but they need to be informed by this collective wisdom. And I do think that shift's happening, and that makes me feel hopeful.
Well, I thank you so much for taking your time and also for the valuable work that you are doing to make the internet and the world much safer. So thank you, Yasmin.
Thank you.
Thank you all.